He walked in without a sound. The glass doors of the public library opened for an old man, worn coat, stained backpack, and a gaze lost in time. It was as if winter itself lived inside him. Every dragging step left a mark of absence on the floor. The children stopped reading. The adults pretended not to notice. But eyes, real eyes, they always notice. He sat in the farthest corner between forgotten biographies, opened a folded notebook and a short pencil. He wrote slowly, as if each word hurt. No one knew who he was, but everyone silently agreed he didn't belong there. The librarian called security. A young guard, fresh from the gym and full of pride, approached like a hero. "You can't stay here, sir. This space is for registered patrons." The old man just looked at him, like someone who had heard that sentence hundreds of times before. And then the guard did the unthinkable, grabbed him by the backpack and shoved him out the door under complicit silent stares. Outside, the veteran dropped to his knees, not from physical weakness, but from the exhaustion of being treated like a burden. He looked up at the gray sky and whispered something under his breath. A name, a vow, something no one inside that library heard, but destiny did. The rain started lightly, as if the sky too felt ashamed. The old man didn't stand up. He remained there, kneeling on the library sidewalk, clinging to his own story like someone hugging a gravestone. Inside his backpack was a folded piece of paper with a trembling signature. Lieutenant Marcus Elias Reed, Ret. Next to it, a medal wrapped in worn cloth. The voices of the past don't need permission to return. They were there, in every drop of rain that touched his face. He heard the radio in the base camp, the screams in the forest, the dry crack of distant rifles. He saw faces he'd never see again. He carried wounds no one else had seen, and the worst part was that, in that moment, he was just another soaked old man, expelled from a place where no one cared to ask his name. A boy on a bike stopped when he saw him. He got off and offered the man a small child's umbrella. The veteran looked at him with a smile that held both gratitude and pain. "You're the first person to see me today," he said. The boy didn't understand the sentence, but he understood the gesture. He stayed there with him, in silence, until a black car pulled up in front of the library. From it stepped a familiar figure. Under the hooded coat stood the mayor, James Whitmore, a calm-spoken man, grave-faced, a former National Guard commander. He entered the library with firm steps, not smiling, not greeting anyone. He simply asked, "Who put that man out?" The silence that followed was deafening. The mayor stared at the librarian with a calm that struck harder than any shout. "Where was he sitting?" he asked. She pointed to the corner where a fallen chair and broken pencil still lay. The mayor walked over and picked up the notebook the old man had left behind. He flipped through it slowly, reading those trembling lines like a sacred will. Inside were names, dates, coordinates, memories, precise records of missing soldiers. Phrases like "last patrol in Ardennes" and "never returned from forward post." But when he turned to the final page, the mayor's blood froze. A yellowed newspaper clipping bore a forgotten headline: "Decorated Hero Saves Entire Unit After Nazi Ambush." The black and white photo showed a younger man in uniform, same eyes, same scar above the brow. It was him, Marcus Elias Reed. The mayor closed the notebook with reverence. "Do you know who that man is?" he asked, voice now unsteady. "You just expelled one of the greatest heroes this town ever produced." No one answered. Some employees lowered their eyes. The security guard, pale, stepped back. The mayor looked at his watch. "Is he still outside?" Outside, the old man remained on the sidewalk, now joined by the boy and a few onlookers who had stopped under the awning. The town was beginning to awaken to something it had ignored for far too long. And in that very moment, the mayor removed his coat, walked through the door, and knelt in front of the veteran, under the light rain and the stunned gazes of a growing crowd. "Mr. Reed, I offer my apology in the name of this city and in the name of my own cowardice." The silence that settled around the library was different now. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of shame. The small crowd began to grow as phones were raised in the air. Someone filmed. Someone posted. Within minutes, footage of a mayor kneeling before a drenched old man flooded local news feeds. But what truly touched people wasn't the act itself. It was the contrast between the man they ignored and the honor he now received, too late. The mayor helped Marcus to his feet and walked with him back into the library. People made way. The old man passed the same shelves that had watched him be thrown out, now as a guest of honor. They invited him to sit in the main reading room. They gave him an old armchair that, for some reason, now looked like a throne. And in front of everyone, the mayor did what no politician enjoys doing. He apologized, publicly, with a shaking voice, and used the full name of the man the city had forgotten. But it was when Marcus pulled his worn notebook from his backpack that the magic began. At the mayor's request, he read one of the pages aloud. It was an unsent letter to the mother of a young soldier who never came back. In it, Marcus described the boy's final act of courage, how he had died shielding others. By the end of the reading, there were tears from librarians, from teenagers who barely knew what Ardennes was, and even from the security guard who had once shoved him out the door. That afternoon, the library was fuller than ever, but no one came for books. They came for something rarer: remorse, respect, memory. The crowd wanted to hear Marcus speak, and he did. Slowly, sparingly, like a man who knows that each word spent is a piece of life given away, because the truth, in the end, always finds a place to rest. Sometimes it just needs a chair in the corner. By the end of the day, Marcus was no longer just a homeless man with a mysterious past. He had become, to many, a mirror of a society that fails to honor its pillars until it's far too late. The video of the mayor kneeling before him crossed 100,000 views in under 4 hours. But beyond the numbers, it was the comments that mattered. Town locals, former soldiers, young people who had never heard of Ardennes, all thanking him, apologizing, wanting to know more. The next morning, the library felt different. Flowers lined the entrance. Children's letters covered the walls. A makeshift portrait of young Marcus in uniform was printed and framed by volunteer hands. But perhaps the most symbolic gesture came from the very guard who had expelled him. He asked to read aloud, in front of everyone, a handwritten letter of apology. Marcus listened in silence, then rose and embraced him. No words. The kind of forgiveness only someone who's seen hell can offer. But the city wanted more. The mayor called an emergency session at City Hall. Within hours, a new resolution was passed, renaming the main room of the library Marcus E. Reed Hall, Memorial to Forgotten Silence, a permanent space, a living archive of letters from soldiers, war stories, and refuge for any veteran who needed a place to rest or to be remembered. And at the center of the room stood the same old armchair where Marcus had once sat, untouched, like a quiet altar reminding all that the most real heroes often walk among us, invisible, until someone finally sees them. In the following week, Marcus began visiting the room that bore his name. Not every day. Sometimes he'd simply sit quietly, then leave. But on a grey Sunday morning before the library opened, he arrived carrying a cardboard box tied with old cords. The mayor, coincidentally arriving early to check on renovations, found him seated on the steps. "I'll tell it today," Marcus said, but only once. Inside the box were more than belongings. There were fragments of soul, yellowed photographs of patrol buddies, letters stained with dirt and blood, short journals with dates crossed by scribbled notes. "Didn't return. Last shift, we burned." One notebook was just a list of names. "These are the ones I carried on my back, the ones who fit, the ones who didn't. They're here," he said, pointing to his chest. Marcus told the story of his last day in the Hurtgen forest. The ambushed platoon, the screams, the grenade that exploded too close, the decision to go back alone and drag out the wounded. He went back 3 times under enemy fire, carrying mutilated men, his feet freezing, a metal shard lodged in his shoulder. He had never spoken of it, never asked for a medal, The only medal he owned was wrapped in old cloth, and he refused to hang it. "Because I didn't bring them all back." The mayor, listening in absolute silence, said nothing, and he was right not to. Marcus wasn't telling the story to be comforted. He told it to be understood. For the first time in years, someone was listening without interrupting, without defending the system, without diagnosing him. Just a broken man, opening a wound no one else had dared to look at. At the end of the conversation, Marcus left a folded note inside the box. It said only, "Mission complete. Now I can go home." That Tuesday morning, the library opened like any other day. Sunlight poured through the high windows, computers blinked to life, and the scent of paper and coffee floated in the air. But something felt off, or rather, something was missing. The bench by the entrance, the one where Marcus sat every morning before walking slowly to the room that bore his name, was empty. Not just unoccupied, but absent, as if something essential had been removed from the scene. The mayor was the first to notice. He arrived with a folder in hand, but stopped before the door. He stood still for a few seconds, staring at the space. He knew, the same way a soldier knows when the radio goes quiet, when silence becomes louder than the sound of war. He entered without a word and walked straight to the Marcus E. Reed Memorial Room. Inside, the box of Marcus's belongings remained untouched, and on the armchair, carefully folded, was the same worn coat Marcus had worn the day he was expelled. The librarian found him later that afternoon. Marcus was sitting on the park bench across from the library. He looked like he was sleeping, eyes closed, head gently tilted, hands folded on his lap. But there was a peace in that body that had never been there in life. The medical report would come days later, an internal collapse caused by a metal fragment still lodged in his shoulder, a World War II injury never removed, quietly infecting him for years. Beside him was a note held down by a small stone. "I was remembered. That was enough. Carry the rest without me." There was no funeral. Marcus had no known family. But by the next day, the square overflowed with candles, folded flags, children's letters and medals, silently left behind by fellow veterans. The city mourned, not just the man, but the time it had wasted pretending he didn't exist. The bench where he once sat was removed, restored, and placed at the library entrance with a bronze plaque. Here sat a man who carried the world, and no one noticed. The name Marcus Elias Reed swept through the town like a quiet breeze that suddenly became a storm. The day after his death, the library received more visitors than it had all year. They didn't come for books. They came for atonement. To understand how a man who had survived the Normandy landings, who crossed the Hurtgen forest with fever and blood in his eyes, died alone on a park bench, ignored for decades. Local newspapers dedicated full front pages to him. The obituary wasn't written by a journalist, but by a group of high school students who had spoken with him days earlier, and who for the first time understood that hero doesn't mean loud or famous. It means surviving in silence. The piece went viral, and within days, veterans across the country began sharing similar stories. Forgotten men, sleeping in shelters, carrying pieces of the world on their backs. The mayor called for a public ceremony, but not at City Hall. He insisted it take place in front of the library, beside the restored bench, now surrounded by folded flags, dry flowers, and heavy silences. Taps played at sunset. A young man played the saxophone. An elderly resident read out loud the names of Marcus's platoon brothers listed in his notebooks, and for the first time in many years, the town heard the names that time had tried to erase. But the most moving part of the ceremony didn't come from politicians or speeches. It came from a woman with tired eyes who handed the mayor a letter. It was dated from the war, written by Marcus to her brother who had died in combat, but the letter had never reached him. "He used to call Marcus Captain Silence," she said. "Said he didn't talk much, but he always acted. I never thought anyone would remember that." And now here he was, a captain of silence, whose absence had become the loudest cry the city ever heard. Marcus Elias Reed never asked for anything. He didn't beg for recognition. He didn't demand to be remembered. He simply existed, carrying in silence the names of those who never returned and the burden of being forgotten by the ones who did. But sometimes a single act of kindness, a moment of real listening, or a heartfelt apology is enough to reopen the gates of dignity that time tried to close. And even though he left too late, he left seen, named, honored. The library had expelled him, but history took him back, and the city that ignored him now carries him in its heart, like a scar turned into a medal. Because true heroes don't die when the heart stops beating. They die when no one remembers them. And Marcus Elias Reed was finally remembered.